Welcome to the Antony Loewenstein podcast. This week, I'm interviewing Grace Tame. Now, Australians will know who Grace Tame is. She was Australian of the Year a few years ago. She's a very, very prominent activist and advocate on child sexual abuse. She was abused herself. We talk about this in the interview. I met Grace a number of years ago. I think it was through a writers' festival, and I've spent time with her in Australia, also in Indonesia, in Bali, where she was a writers' festival guest along with me. And what I like about Grace is she's honest. She's no bullshit. She speaks to power. She challenges power. We speak mostly about the issue of child abuse and platforms, digital platforms that embrace that tragically and outrageously. And I think it's a really interesting interview that'll give you a lot of insights and food for thought. If you want to support what I'm doing, please do so. You can find out information in the show notes. Let's get to the interview. Grace Tame, thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Antony. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion.
Now tell me, how would you like to be described? How do you define your bio? You give it to me.
Take your pick. I've got many monikers. Well, let's start with probably the most obvious, which is that I am a survivor of child sexual abuse, both institutional and incest. I am now an advocate for fellow survivors, a public speaker, and a columnist. Not to be mistaken with communist, although I am also a communist. And was recently labelled by Jared Henderson as the attack dog of the left.
And for those who don't know, Jared Henderson is a columnist from the Murdoch Press in Australia and has been around for seemingly 100 years. Yes,
we might call him the attack dog of the right. So
indeed. And you're based currently where are you based in Australia?
Can you say? I am in Edgecliff currently.
Okay, in Sydney. Okay.
Yes.
Now, I wanted to have you on today to talk a little bit about this, what seems to be at least growing public conversation. And you're someone who's been talking about this issue for a long time. I guess the proliferation of the use of AI to develop and make horrific child exploitation videos, amongst other things. Obviously, the issues around porn have been around for a long time. The internet in the last 10, 15 years has exploded that. I wanted to give an example of a story so viewers just get a bit of a sense of what we're talking about here. Now, I wanted to ask you, there's language that's used in this story. It's from the US that I'd like you to critique and respond to. This came out a few weeks ago in the US. A 47-year-old Kansas man in the US who used artificial intelligence to create child pornography has been sentenced to 25 years in prison. Jeremy Weber of Topeka was convicted on 5 counts of transportation of child pornography and 1 count of possessing child pornography. The US Attorney's Office for Kansas said in a release that Weber uploaded pictures of women and children he knew into a publicly available AI platform. He then utilized AI to manipulate and merge these images into hundreds of depictions of child sex abuse material. He also uploaded previously trafficked images to the same platform. Now, there are many of these kinds of cases. Now, when you hear that, we discussed before we came on this interview, the language that is used to describe these kinds of crimes, just talk a bit about how you think we should be describing these crimes and what do you think when you hear about this kind of case?
I have a lot of thoughts. First of all, child pornography is a term that has been phased out. It's now called child sexual abuse material or child exploitation material. For the reason that calling it pornography normalizes it and fetishizes it, and any material depicting a child is exploitative. There's no consent involved. So, whereas pornography featuring consenting adults is not necessarily abusive, but every case of a child whose developmental limitations stop them from being able to consent in any circumstances is never okay.
Yeah.
My first thought is that whilst the coverage and, as you said, sort of the public discussion around these things feels like it's relatively new, it's not. So to go back about, well, nearly 40 years, in 1986, the then US Attorney General held a commission on pornography. And on page 601 of their final report, they stated very clearly child sex offenders are using computer networks to trade child sexual abuse material. Now, this was traditional child exploitation material that obviously did not involve what we call artificial intelligence, which is a broad term that has many applications. And that's one of the complications of AI, is that it is very hard to define. But essentially, we're looking at very sophisticated, very motivated offenders using whatever technology, whatever tools are at their disposal to facilitate their offending. And this particular cohort of criminals, child sex offenders, are often the first adopters of new technologies that become publicly available, because sexual gratification and this type of criminality, which isn't necessarily motivated by sexual interest as much as it is motivated by power and control, is a leading driver of tech literacy. Um, so, this has been a problem. Child sex offenders using the internet, using technologies. It's been a problem for nearly 40 years. And it's only been in recent years that we've been hearing the tech sector itself kind of own up to its potential for harm. And then governments in response, coming out with all these hand-wringing cries about the so-called urgent need for online safety. So I guess I'm a bit jaded.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, you're obviously much more involved in this advocacy than I am. But what's always seems remarkable to me is I just read in the last few months. So the gaming platform Roblox, which is popular, used by huge amounts of people all over the world. There was recently stories which I'd read rumors about this for a long time. Essentially, was allowing grooming to occur on their platform. There was
Yes.
an interview. There was an interview with the head of that organization recently. People can find this online. And the interview was frankly a car crash when he either denied it was a major problem or sort of saw it not in a way that required serious attention. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's been no real government response in any major country. Now, this ties into what you were saying, right? That a lot of hand wringing, and there's been huge amounts of evidence of massive amounts of platforms where this is happening as well. It's not just that, it's Facebook and others. So, talk about the hand wringing. Why is there hand wringing but no action?
Well, I would say that the world that we're living in, which is becoming increasingly digitally dependent, it demands buy-in. Any major government is using technology. Um, you know, whether it's in its sort of like day-to-day operations, just like emails and things like that, but then also at that higher level, at that more like the security level. And you've written all about this surveillance tech,
Totally.
spyware, weapons technology in general. They're sort of, their hands are tied. They are spending enormous, just unfathomable amounts of money on tech innovation, um, essentially for the purposes of control
Yeah.
and surveillance of large groups of people. Um, and so, their interest is they're compromised. And quite frankly, protection of children is not a profitable industry. Genuine safeguarding of children. I just want to clarify, I'm not talking about child protection, like child removal. I'm talking
Yeah.
about
Yes.
the general safeguarding of children, both on and offline. It just doesn't make a lot of money. It's sad because, at a conservative estimate, child exploitation costs taxpayers in the Australian context alone over $6 billion a year. And we have spent, or the government has committed over a 10-year period through the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse, which sort of kicked off in 2021. The federal government has committed about 307 million over that 10-year period. And when you break that down, that's about, it's just over 30 million per annum. Whereas the annual defense budget just between 2024 and 2025 for that financial year is projected to be something like 55 billion. And one could say, oh, well, you're comparing apples and oranges here, preparing for conflicts and national security. And I'm like, arguably the best thing we can do for national security is to invest in the safety, education, and general well-being of our children who are our future. But that's just me.
Do you see, with the Trump administration coming in the US, these issues clearly didn't appear since Trump, I know, face plant, but has there been, I know we're not based in the US, we're based in Australia, but obviously you look at these things globally as well.
As you know, we import so many policies from not just like at the cultural level, like at the actual structural policy level. We import so, and we have to, because we are like a spineless little colony of the United States essentially, and they dictate the play with their defense strategy. So we kind of just,
in terms of the issue of so-called child protection, or the issue of, I mean, have you seen any changes, less regulation, not that there's much even now, since Trump took into office in January 2025, or there's been just pretty much a continuation from, say, the Biden administration and other administrations before? Have you seen any radical change, I guess, for the worse since Trump came back round two?
Oh, most certainly. It's been an accelerated sort of just dismantling of the very loose structures that were there previously. It's an interesting time. You were talking about that case before. I think some of the key differences that have exacerbated this problem that had existed for, as we discussed, tens of years, decades, is the fact that whereas previously there was kind of almost a prohibitive, or at least a more complicated process to both produce and distribute child exploitation material. You would have to record it. You potentially, I mean, depending on how rough you wanted it to be, you might have to go through an editing phase, and then you would have to figure out how to distribute it online. Whereas now, child sex offenders are able to, there's a very low barrier to entry. So they're able to download these programs off the internet, and input prompts, and instantaneously create and proliferate very and increasingly realistic child exploitation material. Now, I just want to clarify, this is not a victimless crime. If you're talking about AI-generated material, it's not fake, because all of these AI systems, and you have found this probably with your work, they are trained on real material. So whether that is written material that they're learning from, or whether it is real pictures of children that they're learning from, because it has to come from somewhere.
Well, it's often stolen, right? I mean, these companies are stealing all the content, right?
It's glorified theft on an industrial scale. So we're seeing that there are, it's much easier to create and distribute child exploitation material, and there's more connectedness between child sex offenders. So they have always been very good at enabling each other through the distribution of material, but also through the sharing of tactics, of strategies of how to abuse children. And we're seeing that offenders are also using chatbots to automate grooming, and they're asking advice of these chatbots on how to hide their material, how to hide their offending. And then if they are detected and have a confrontation with law enforcement, they're asking them what are the things that they should say to mitigate their punishment. so the level of calculation is increasing, and these AI systems are only emboldening them, and increasing their reach.
Can you give me a bit of a sense of, give me some statistics of what sort of scale we're talking about? We can talk about Australia, we talk about the US. Obviously, one probably can't speak globally because every country is different, although I know there are obviously similarities in many nations. Give me a bit of a sense of what the scale of these issues are.
The Internet Watch Foundation found that in 2024, from the previous year, so between 2023 and 2024, there was a 1,325% increase in cyber tip reports of child exploitation material online.
That's
That's
massive.
not 100 and 150. That's
Uh,
1,325% in 1 year.
yeah.
And this is becoming so widespread. And as you said before, offenders are not just operating on the dark web, where their forums are the membership numbers are not in the tens or even hundreds. Their membership numbers are in the hundreds of thousands. But beyond the dark web, on the clear web, on platforms like, gaming platforms, but also meta platforms, Facebook. And what is incredibly frustrating is that these platforms now, instead of going, how can we embed safety by design? How can we regulate? How can we make sure that we're protecting children? They've gone, actually, let's wipe our hands clean and encrypt our messaging platforms. So now even Facebook has an encrypted end-to-end messaging platform, so they can go, oh, we couldn't see what was going on. We didn't know that there was a child sex offender using Facebook Messenger to groom, surveil, and organize offending. And that's been a problem, I mean, in my own personal experience, which is going back nearly 16 years now. Nicholas Bester, the now thrice convicted child sex offender who abused me, he was grooming me, surveilling me, and arranging offending against me. On Facebook, he had several fake Facebook profiles, which he even went to the trouble of making talk to each other publicly to avoid suspicion so they didn't look fake. And, was using the school's internet server to run his own Amway business. Um, Once a pyramid schemer, always a pyramid schemer,
Yeah.
and there's a bit of a Venn diagram there, I would say, between pyramid
Mm.
schemes and calculated offending. But as I said, it's not as if there hasn't been a wealth of evidence of the capabilities of offenders, what they're prepared to do, just with the most basic tools that they can weaponize.
I want to get to the offenders in a minute, but let me just stick with the platforms for a second.
Mm.
Have you, over the years, you've been a prominent advocate on this issue for a long time for very good reason. Have you had any positive, and clearly the end result has been nothing, which is not your fault, it's the platform's fault. Any interactions? Like if you had the Metas or others saying, "Hi Grace, we'd love to talk to you." Now maybe you're going to say I'm delusional to even ask that question, but I'm interested. I mean, you've spoken about these platforms for years. Has there been any interaction between them, or if there has been, has it been sort of lip service on their part?
I have had no positive interaction with the tech sector whatsoever. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, the
As in
tech. Sorry.
nothing positive? As in no dialogue at all, or
No,
nothing?
no. So the most recent interaction that I had, and it was sort of secondhand, was actually um, in 2022, after my book had been advertised as soon to be released. Nicholas Bester, who I mentioned before, who has already been to prison twice for three separate child exploitation related offences. So not just the repeated offending against me, but he also was found with like 28 multimedia files of child abuse material on his home computer, which included videos of other adults raping children. And then he also was convicted of producing child exploitation material in descriptive form. In fact, he is the first man in Australia to be convicted and jailed for that particular offence. But in 2022, when he found out that I was releasing a book, he reacted very poorly to that, and it is alleged that under his own name on his personal Twitter account, 3 times he threatened to enact revenge upon me. And these tweets were like flagged by myself with what was previously called Twitter. And their initial responses were that they did not meet the threshold for threats. Now, we're not talking about someone just out of the blue, saying that they might enact revenge upon me. We're talking about someone who actually has been to prison twice for offending against me. So it's aggravated circumstances, and yet Twitter had no interest in helping. And so it's actually currently still it's going through the courts. So that
Right.
was my most recent interaction with a platform in regards to this issue. Um, Otherwise, I have a very good relationship with Julie Inman Grant, who I highly respect, and I just do not envy
Just
her.
explain who she is. Just explain who she is, Grace. A lot of
Ju-
people listening and
Uh,
not based in Australia. So who is she? Yeah.
so Julie Inman Grant is Australia's e-safety commissioner. So
Yeah.
her role is
Big job.
essentially,
Put it
yes,
mildly. Big job.
it's a massive job, and now she's under attack from the US administration, who are accusing her of censorship, and among other things.
Mm.
Um, but my and she's previously of the tech industry, um, but she's been a driving force for better regulation in the Australian context in particular. Um, and there's soon to be a ban for under 16-year-olds, social media ban
I want to ask you about that
implemented.
actually. So, yeah, so for those overseas who don't know, don't live in Australia, Australia is introducing in December 2025 a social media ban for those under 16. No one quite knows exactly how it's going to work, but there's obviously been, putting aside the tech sector's complaints, I think their reasoning is spurious, but there's obviously a debate amongst civil libertarians and others. How do you see that issue around under 16s? I mean, obviously some under 16s are going to be still using social media clearly, but at least the plan is to make it more difficult for some. How do you see all those competing issues?
I think it's important to state up front that it's not a technology ban, which perhaps people seem to have conflated the two, technology in general and social media. Social media is a subset of technology, of online news, and it's not an online ban either. It's purely of social media platforms, which are a sort of two-way or multi-way exchange between individuals and other accounts that aren't necessarily who they say they are. And so it's
Yeah.
removing that potential for anonymized sources of harm or interaction that are like patently unsafe, I would say, for any individual, whether they're a child or not, but in particular for children who are vulnerable, who are often looking for connection um, in places where they're unable to find it in their real life, sadly. Um, so I call me old fashioned. I am a boomer in spirit, so it's one of the many reasons
Even
that
though you're much younger than a boomer, let's put that on the record, but yes.
someone asked me if I was 18 the other day, and I was like, "You can be my friend. I'm not 18. I'm about to turn 30. Although spiritually, I'm well into my 80s.
Got
And
it.
Spotify thinks that I'm about 80 as well. I just got my Spotify wrap. I think that the social media ban is a step that should be lauded, considering the context we just discussed about the knowledge, the proof that the tech sector, that governments worldwide have had about not just the potential, but the very real repeated harms we've seen through technology use. And up until now, sort of the very little, if any, action to do anything about it.
Mm. I wanted to ask you about I asked you before about your interaction with tech companies, which clearly has been depressing at best. How about with politicians? Now, obviously, for those who don't know, for those outside Australia, I'll just give a bit of context for viewers. Grace was Australian of the Year in which year?
2021.
2021. We had in Australia a previous more conservative government. Scott Morrison was our Prime Minister. He's no longer the Prime Minister, thankfully. And Grace had people can Google this if they're interested, I guess an interaction with him where she gave him what's the best expression?
The
A side
side
eye
eye.
or
Yeah.
side eye. He was terrible on many, many issues. I wanted to ask you more recently, obviously we've had a Labor government in Australia federally for a number of years now since the Morrison government lost. What sort of interaction, obviously Anthony Albanese is the Prime Minister, but there are many ministers in his government. Have you felt there has been any better reception to what we've been talking about, these issues? I guess the social media ban is coming from their government, to be sure. But what's your assessment of what interactions have you had? I'm not asking you to give us, private conversations, but what's your general sense of the commitment or understanding of some of these issues with the current Australian government?
I think that the current government has done better, although, it's a very low bar.
Yeah.
I think that the current government is, you know, it is trying. It is hard because of what we spoke about before, that they're sort of, they're operating in a digitally dependent economy that demands buy-in of sorts, and they
Mm.
do want to. Like AI is something that they're hesitant to regulate because they want to make the most of tech innovations for other areas. And the trouble is as well, when we're talking about exploitation in general, child sexual abuse is often monstered by other crimes, and that's not to dismiss their significance, but it often becomes um, lost under the umbrella of gender-based violence, where it becomes essentially a footnote. And if we zoom out and look at the prevalence of child exploitation, I mean, children are essentially 20% of the Australian population, but they are the majority of sexual assault victims. 50% of people convicted of a sex offence in Australia are convicted of a child sex offence. 50%. And what I am waiting to see is a more proportionate response and a shift in focus, not away from response and intervention, but a shift in focus that prioritizes prevention. Because there's a cycle here. So in 2023, at the end of 2023, the University of New South Wales released the first national perpetrator survey. It was a study of child sexual offending behaviours and attitudes among Australian men, and it found that 1 in 10 Australian men has committed an offence against a child. 2/3 of that offending takes place online. It found that these men are more likely to be middle-aged, Caucasian, married, socially supported, highly educated, earning a decent wage, and frequent and adept internet users. It also found that these men are 6 times more likely than the average man to have been sexually abused in childhood themselves. So we can start to see that child exploitation is predeterminate of more child exploitation. So if we can address these things, like most things, in their infancy, before they become a sort of biologically ingrained potential, we reduce their ability to potentiate into actual offending.
So let me ask you, so Grace suddenly becomes Prime Minister. I don't know
Oh,
if that's something you're...
fuck that.
No, I know you don't want to be, but let's just say in a different world you are, or you have someone who has real power to implement certain policies or changes. Give me a sense of some of these issues we just talked about. I guess greater intervention to try to prevent kids turning into adults, particularly men who might commit horrible crimes. What sort of things do you think could be implemented that could potentially really make a difference here that are not currently being done?
Child sexual abuse covers a broad spectrum of offending. It's a very complicated issue and therefore requires a suite of solutions. There's no one size fits all or magic bullet that's
True.
going to address this issue. I think there are some key things if we're talking specifically about technology and technology advancing these issues. Something that the tech sector can do is embed safety by design. Something that a government can do is legislate a duty of care and also legislate, punishment for non-compliance to such a duty of care. And that's very low hanging fruit. I mean, I think there are already moves to outlaw the low hanging fruit, such as notify apps, which only have a nefarious intention. There's no good reason why you would be non-consensually undressing a photo of somebody. So outlawing notify apps, outlawing other apps that are clearly designed for exploitative purposes. And it's hard because, like I said before, um, there's not a lot of profit in child exploitation, and these software developers, these sort of app creators, are all rushing to establish market dominance in what is a relatively lawless, borderless, and constantly evolving domain. We need to incentivize safeguarding, and there's no legislation, there's sort of no pressure that is actually incentivizing anyone or de-incentivizing certain activity. So I think that would really go a long way to changing the landscape. And in terms of in terms of offending and being aware of it, so I think that the general public still struggles to understand and identify grooming behaviors, which are the precipitating behaviors that lead to on and offline offending. And that is the real that's the real intervention point that can make such a difference and can actually stop abuse before it starts. And part of the reason why there is so much misunderstanding of these sort of preparatory behaviors is because a lot of them do look benign in isolation. So it might just be like gift giving or praise or, special attention, opportunity, etc. But when considered in the context of offending, and like when you consider them as an aggregate of behaviors, it's much different. So I think that highly specialized education for people charged with the responsibility of caring for children, whether that be parents themselves or daycarers, educators, even judges, and people in the legal fraternity, educating people about how to not only identify grooming behaviors, but understanding how they uniquely impact the developing child brain. Because a lot of the responses to grooming are what we would consider to be counterintuitive, because the very goal of an offender is to exploit the attachment drive, the biological attachment drive of a child to bond with their caregiver, especially when they're distressed or frightened. So you're going to see a natural attachment of children to people who are posing as confidants, friends, or even parental substitutes. So understanding how that mechanism works, I think, would go a long way to the prevention of a certain amount of child exploitation.
I wanted to ask you finally, Grace, a bit of a different issue but related. Now, in the last 10 years, a man like Donald Trump can be president once.
Is he a
can be
man?
president-
Is he?
Well, indeed. Is
He
he a
looks
man?
like a Satsuma that's been dropped on the carpet and like got lint, sort of, Anyway, sorry.
Let's just say he's a human. We can probably argue he's a human at least, if not a man. I guess my question wasn't particularly just about his presidency, which we can, criticize for hours, rightly so. But someone like Trump is really a proud groomer. He's a proud abuser. He's a proud rapist. And at least in 2016 and in 2024, he arguably had pretty terrible Democratic opponents. But putting that issue aside, he won the presidency. There's no question about that twice. And I guess my question to you was more about how do you, and I know we're not American, we're Australian, but how do you explain the so-called appeal, and he's one of many men who were like that. The so-called appeal of someone like that, including amongst many women. I mean, it wasn't just men who voted for Trump and not at all, actually. Different demographics, racial backgrounds, etc. What's
Yeah.
your explanation for that?
Look, I'm not a political expert by any stretch of the imagination. I actually did live in the United States for nearly 6 years and was
Mm,
there in the lead up to the first election, the first administration of Trump, and for the first part of it before COVID hit and I decided to move back to Australia.
yeah,
It's interesting if we look back through Trump's ascension to the presidency, it's not as recent as some might think. I mean, he was attempting to break into politics in the 80s.
yeah,
He actually wanted to buy the News of the World, which was eventually bought by Ghislaine Maxwell. Oh, sorry, not Ghislaine Maxwell, sorry, her father, Robert Maxwell. Interestingly. But that was sort of his first foray into politics because he understood the power of narrative and he understood the power of like owning that narrative and being the first to set that narrative. But in terms of his appeal, I mean, he's cast a very wide net, and he's sort of got a narrative for, and they're often
yeah,
contradicting. If you were to line them all up and line all the things
yeah,
that he's just, I mean, he's a every single day, actually, arguably multiple times a day, he is saying something inflammatory, dishonest, and just sort of like almost like cartoonistic. That's very hard to know which way to look, and I think that's part of the point. You know, if I think about um, again my experience of someone who was so brazenly like arrogant and criminal. I'm talking about the men who abused me, but at the same time so charming. And
yeah,
it seems like those two things would could not coexist, but they can. You know, the way that he was able to offend against students at my high school for nearly 20 years openly without being challenged was that he just desensitized everyone to the point where it was normal. Um, but he also, much like Trump does, has a sort of litigious strategy, you know, of talking a big talk, but then also threatening. So
yeah,
Mr. Bester was regularly making sexist remarks, and he's a fan of Trump. In fact, in those recent threat from 2022, one of the things he said, along with the fact that he was intending to enact revenge upon me, was bring back Donald Trump. So you
wow,
see that, but
okay.
there's a
So
sort of
that fits, doesn't it?
if the shoe fits. um,
Yeah,
you know, it's this brazenness and this refusal to back down even if you are challenged, and the ability to flip the script wherever necessary to invert the roles of offender and victim. Trump is
mm,
very good at doing that,
yeah,
even if he's so clearly in the wrong. There's a power that he gets purely from distracting people.
mm,
um you know, and in the lead up to this second election, like there were just the media was just helping him at every turn, even media that was arguably against him. They were just giving him attention. You know, anytime he was flying in somewhere, there'd be a headline about, and it's like that sort of that attention and that inflation of his importance out of proportion to his actual importance only serves him. So I think that he's been able to ingratiate himself with a large and sort of you know, like broad ranging cohort is is by just is by being a chameleon.
yeah. Grace, I wanted to thank you for taking the time. I know some of these conversations you do have quite regularly with others, or some of them anyway, but I know that they are very personal and I know it would take a toll. And I guess I wanted to thank you for taking the time to speak to me today. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Some discussions are easier and more engaging than others, and I have very much enjoyed this, as I always do. You know, you and I are friends, and we see eye to eye
Yeah.
on, I would say, just about everything. So that
Yeah.
that makes it a lot easier to do this work. And I
Thank
have to
you.
say thank you. I mean, your contributions to sort of positive change and awareness raising in the last, I mean, for decades, but in particular the last 3 to 5 years has been incredible, and we all owe you
Thanks,
so
Grace.
much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Grace. Thank
It's
you.
okay.
Thank you so much for watching or listening to the Antony Loewenstein podcast. If you want to support this show, which is essential for it to continue, there's details in the show notes to give money, to give weekly or monthly donations. Let's keep doing this. So many more episodes to come. Please send this to friends or enemies, share it on social media, and let's do it.